Hello! I'm super excited to start this course with you, but as always, we need to see where we're starting and where we're ending up so we have a clear path to becoming a React Native developer. So let's see what this course looks like for you. Now keep in mind that the goal of this course is for you to be able to build any mobile apps, both on iOS and Android, that you want. There's a reason that companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Walmart are heavily using React Native, and we're gonna learn all about it. So how do we start? Well, obviously the first thing we're gonna do is learn about the React Native foundations. How does it work? What is actually happening? How do we write code and then have that code work on our phones? Everything to do with mobile development, we're gonna learn in this section. But here's the thing, in order for you to learn React Native, you also need to learn React. Now, for some of you taking this course, you already have experience with React. But for those who don't, we actually offer a second path where you can do an introductory React section so you get familiar with the concept. For those that already know React, you can skip that section. Now, from there, we're gonna go right into building things. Our first app that we're gonna build is Focus Time. And this is a real app that you're gonna have on your phone that will actually make you more productive. Using the Pomodoro technique, you're gonna be able to have better study habits, so actually build a useful app that hopefully you can use throughout the course. In here, you'll learn all the basics about React Native and how to go from zero to having something on your phone. Now, one of the hardest things of being a mobile developer is the environment setup. So we're gonna make sure that we accommodate everybody. Whether you are a Windows, Mac, or Linux user, or you have an Android or an iOS phone, or no phone, we're going to use tools like Expo, Xcode, Android Studio, iPhone simulators, Android simulators, and other tools so that you can follow along this course no matter what tools you have, and you get to pick the developer environment that you want. All right, so that was just the beginning of the course. We've built an app, we have some understandings of React Native, but nothing solid yet. Because to really learn a technology, you have to build things with it. You have to build big applications, big apps to truly understand the power and go off on your own and build something great. So we dive into our master project. That's right, this course is all about learning by doing. Once we have the basics, we're gonna start building our restaurant recommendation app called Meals to Go. Now you've already seen in the promo video what the app looks like. It looks really, really good, and we have a lot of features that we're gonna add. So as we learn about React Native, we're gonna build up this massive app that you'll be able to show off. We're gonna use things like React Navigation, which allows us to have multiple pages and navigation on our app. We're gonna learn about users and how to use things like Firebase to have user sign-in, sign-out, authentication. A very important thing for almost any app. We're going to learn about styling our apps using tools like styled components and other tools around the web to build really pretty apps that look good. Now I know people get excited about this, so later on in the course, we're also going to implement Stripe payments so you can actually take payments from your app because, hey, if you're building an app, might as well make money out of it. But before we get into Stripe or all these payments, we're also going to build a map feature on our app so that we can search for restaurants in different locations. And we're going to use what most apps use in this case, which is the Google Maps API. So you're going to learn to work with APIs as well. Finally, you also get to learn about animations. Mobile apps are interactive. You need to have good user experience. And in here, we're going to use a very popular library by Airbnb called Lottie to learn about animations and how we can add animations to our app. It's going to be a lot of fun. At the end of it all, once we've built up the code, once we've learned how to build apps using React Native, how to build large apps using React Native, that's when we get to have fun a bit and add a bit more styling to our app, different colors, different patterns, so that by the end of it, all of our apps are going to look unique, so that it's not just a generic app that looks the same for everybody. We want you to be able to put this project on your portfolio and stand out. Oh, and I almost forgot. At the end of it all, we're gonna teach you how to actually deploy these apps to the App Store and Google Play Store because, why else will we build an app? We are building an app so that we can distribute it to others around the world. So we're going to learn all about that, both on iOS and Android, about device permissions, about styling and layout. And by the way, if I didn't mention this already, this course uses the latest version of React Native, which means, yep, that's right, we're going to be using React hooks to build our app. And then finally, we're going to also learn about how to debug our apps, how to improve them constantly, so that when we put them on the App Store or the Google Play Store and people report bugs, we know how to fix those. As you can see, we have a lot to cover, but it's going to be a lot of fun. I promise you, we'll make it fun along the way. And as long as you give us your attention and focus, you'll come out of the other end a strong React Native developer. You know what people love? People love to be on their phones. You know what else people love? They love food. People need to eat food. So he's combining the two ideas and says, hey, let's build a mobile app that allows our customers to discover new restaurants, new food places, new takeout options. He thinks this is going to be the next big idea, and he wants you to build it. But here's the thing. You're just starting out. Sure, you passed the interview and Bruno hired you, but how do you actually build a mobile app? What technology do you use? How do you even get started? And this course is all about that. We're going to take you from scratch to building a fully production-ready mobile app and making our boss, Bruno, happy, because I have a feeling that when things don't go his way, he's going to be very angry with us. But don't worry, we got you covered. We're going to start from the beginning, learn the basics, figure out how we're going to build the app. Hint, hint, we're going to use React Native, and then build an app that will take over the world. Exciting times ahead. Let's get started. Why do we use React Native? Why should we use React Native? And what are all our options? Get ready for this. I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson. So how do we get here? How do we get to a land where we have apps on our phone? Well, if you know, just like on your computer, applications or apps are designed to run on a particular operating system. We have iOS for the iPhones, and then we have Android for all other phones, like Samsung, like Google phones. And these are the two major operating systems in the world. But the thing is, you can't take one app, let's say an iOS app, and just run it on an Android app. Just like you can't use a Windows application on an Apple. I mean, sure you can, but usually there's different download options. If you have a Mac, then download this app. If you have a Windows, then download this version of the app. And without getting too much into the details, this has to do with the underlying architecture that these operating systems are built on. iOS runs apps in a certain way. Android runs apps in a certain way. So in order for us to target 99% of smartphone users that use iOS or Android, we have to build two apps, one for Android and one for iOS. That's not very fun, is it? But that's the reality. Most companies, when they start, they decide, hey, should we target Android or should we target iOS first? And then from there, build their second version of their app that works in the other operating system, just like on Windows or Macs. So initially, when Apple came up with the App Store, they said, hey, if you want to build an app, well, you need to use this language called Objective-C, which they created. Use Objective-C and you can code and build an app that can be put on the App Store. Then Google came along and said, oh, I want an App Store too. So they created the Google Play Store, and they said, with the Google Play Store, you're going to have to use Java programming language to build an app. Now, here's a trick question. Okay, not that tricky because it's going to be obvious. How do you think these operating systems are written? What language is iOS written in? That's right, iOS is written in Objective-C and C. And that's why you build your apps in the same language that the operating system is built in. Same with Android. Android is written in Java. That's why you write apps for Android in Java. Then a few years passed and Apple said, hey, we have a new language, Swift. It's a little bit cleaner, nicer than Objective-C, so that Apple can say, hey, use Swift. It's going to be a lot nicer as a developer for you to build apps on our store. So now you can use two languages, again, both created by Apple. Then Google came up with Kotlin. Kotlin is, again, a nicer version of Java, makes things a little bit nicer for developers, for programmers to build Android apps. So now, if you want to build an iOS app, you would use one of these two languages. If you want to build an Android app, then you'd use one of these two languages. But here's the thing. Are you stuck? Is that the only option for you? Actually, no. This was just a small subset. Because people can get creative. You see, up until now, we talked about the native way of creating an app. A native way just means the intended way, the way that the phone intends you to build an app, either using Objective-C and Swift or Java and Kotlin. But there's one big problem. If you want to target both phones, then you essentially need two separate teams of developers, which costs money, each one specializing in their own language to build an app that is essentially doing the same thing for two things. Companies didn't really like that so much. So a few alternatives came to be. By the way, I hope you're not sleeping during this history lesson because things are about to get exciting. One of the first solutions that came to be in this environment was the web. We browse the web. We use Chrome, we use Safari, we use Firefox. So Cordova was one of the first things that came out that said, hey, instead of playing around with all this native nonsense that is really, really hard to program in, why don't we just use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we use on the web to display information to user, to display web pages, and just pretend like they're native things. So things like Cordova and Ionic do something called using the web view. And WebView is a browser that's actually bundled inside of the mobile application. And we essentially create a hybrid app. So instead of using a native way, a native view that an iOS or an Android app might use, instead, we have a browser that has some of the browser tabs missing. But it still makes it look like an app on your phone. This way, you're able to code an app in JavaScript instead of, let's say, Swift or Kotlin. And that's because JavaScript is very popular. A lot of people know JavaScript. So they can create, if you know how to create websites or web apps, well, then you can create a hybrid app on the mobile phone as well. And those hybrid apps can actually be put on both app stores. How awesome is that? The problem with the web, though, was that, well, you're essentially shipping a browser view inside of this phone, and both iOS and Android apps are optimized to run native code. So no matter what, this web view version of apps was always slower, was clunkier than native apps. Also, Android and iOS have different looks. For example, on Android, the navigation is usually on the top, while iOS navigation is usually on the bottom. And there's all these different looks and feels of Android and iOS apps. So with this web view option, you kind of had to settle on just one look and hope that it looks good enough. So it was almost like a downgrade from native apps, but at the convenience of having to only build it once and have it in both operating systems. Now, one of my first projects that I ever worked on was a Cordova app. And I remember this specifically being an issue where we always had performance issues because we used a web view instead of native views, which are just much faster. But also, we always had this weird app that never looked like an iOS app, never looked like an Android app because we're trying to please both things. Now, things like Ionic have made this experience better, but no matter what, when you use the web on mobile, it's just never going to have the performance that you want. So you never build a serious app, a native app, using these technologies. Now, another option that came quite recently was this idea of a progressive web app. And progressive web app is essentially a web app, that is a website, that you're able to download on your phone or potentially even use it offline like you would with a native app. For example, we can go to a progressive app store, and here we have all these progressive apps that are on my browser, on my Chrome browser, because they're web-based. They use things like service workers, app manifest, these web tricks to pretend like they're mobile apps. And yes, you can download them on your phone, but they're not really native. They're more web than anything. It's something Google came up with, but again, when it comes to performance, it's just not there. So now we get to the exciting part. What if we can have the best of both worlds? What if we can have native code that is performant, but also use this idea of write once and run on both iOS and Android? And that's where we get into this box over here. But this video is getting long, so let's take a break and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. I know. You just want to get coding started, but we're almost done. And I promise this is an important thing to learn before we dive into the code, so we understand exactly what the code is doing. Now, back to that history lesson. We're now at the native-like part. We know that native mobile apps are really performing really good, but you almost need two separate teams to create an app. Web was great because you only had to write it once and it worked on both phones. However, it just didn't have that good performance. Then we have native-like tools. We first had something called Xamarin. And Xamarin was something out of Microsoft. It's a way for us to write iOS mobile apps and Android apps using the .NET framework created by Microsoft in the C# language. And essentially what it does is compiles code to native. So you write the code in C#, and then it converts that code, compiles it to native code. Now there's a bit of extra things that they usually do to make this work, but for now, let's just simplify things. Essentially what they're doing is you get to write it in some other language and then compile it to native, and it works on both phones. It sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? And that was a pretty popular tool with the Microsoft world, but then came React Native. And React Native really took off this idea of native-like development. You see, the difference between something like React Native and Cordova is that Cordova runs inside this web view, right? React Native, because it's native-like, actually have direct access to this native side of the phone. So with React Native, we can have native views. So views that get actually compiled to what iOS intends, what Android intends, so that they're really performant. So with React Native, we can use, just like Xamarin, JavaScript, which is a very popular language, and the React library to create these views that get compiled, get converted to their individual iOS or Android native views. So React Native apps have the same feel and performance as that of native application. Now, React Native came out of Facebook because Facebook has a lot of mobile apps. So they've invested a lot of money to have something that's able to write an app in both mobile operating systems using just one team. Now, Flutter is a more recent native-like framework that we can use to do the exact same thing like React Native. There are some subtle differences, but Flutter came out of Google for Google to try and keep up with this trend. Now, you're taking this course because you want to learn React Native. So I'm not trying to sell you on React Native or anything like that. Obviously, you're already interested, but I do want to talk quickly about which one to choose, because you'll get this question a lot. For example, Bruno wants you to build an app. How can you convince Bruno that React Native is the way to go when you have so many options? Bruno's going to ask you, why are you doing it in React Native? Why aren't you using Cordova or Ionic? Why aren't you doing native using Swift and Kotlin? Why aren't you using Flutter? So because Bruno's going to ask us this question, in the next video, let's tackle why we should use React Native when we have all these options.